There is a strange experience that many people have already lived through, and almost no one talks about it. You finally find silence. No noise, no demands, no urgency. Everything is calm, everything is quiet, everything is under control. And even so, something inside you becomes restless. A tension appears. An uncomfortable sensation arises, as if something were wrong, as if silence were dangerous. This reaction can happen at night, when the house becomes quiet, when the lights go out, when movement slows down, or it can happen during the day, in a moment of pause, in a break, in an instant of stillness. And this creates a disturbing question. Why does silence feel uncomfortable? Why does silence feel strange? Why does silence, which should bring peace, sometimes bring discomfort? The answer may surprise you. Silence is not the problem. The problem is what appears when silence arrives. When the environment becomes quiet, the brain becomes more attentive, more sensitive, more vigilant, because silence reduces distraction. And when distraction decreases, perception increases. That increase in perception can reveal something that was hidden. Internal sensations, unresolved thoughts, accumulated tension, ignored body signals. Silence works like an amplifier. It does not create discomfort. It reveals discomfort. There is an important concept in neuroscience that helps explain this. This concept is called sensory amplification. Sensory amplification is the increase in perception of stimuli when the environment becomes quiet. When there are many external stimuli, the brain distributes attention. When there are few stimuli, the brain concentrates attention, and that concentration can make small sensations feel more intense. A stronger heartbeat, a more noticeable breath, a more evident muscle tension, a clearer bodily sensation. These sensations were always there, but environmental noise hid them. When the noise disappears, perception increases. This phenomenon is known as interoceptive processing. Interoception is the ability to perceive signals from inside the body: heartbeats, breathing, temperature, tension, physical sensations. In silent environments, interoception intensifies. The brain begins to monitor the body more closely. That monitoring is natural, but it can be interpreted as threat, especially when the system is in survival mode. There is another important concept here: cognitive noise. Cognitive noise is the amount of mental stimulation that keeps the mind occupied. Conversations, tasks, notifications, movement, information. These stimuli function as distraction. They occupy attention. They reduce internal awareness. When cognitive noise disappears, the mind becomes more aware, more sensitive, more exposed. This state can create discomfort, not because silence is dangerous, but because silence reveals what was being avoided. Another interesting aspect emerges at this point. The brain was designed to monitor the environment. For thousands of years, silence meant uncertainty. Silence could signal risk. Silence could signal change. Silence could signal threat. That is why the system learned to pay attention when the environment becomes quiet. This response is called environmental vigilance, a protection mechanism, an automatic mechanism, a silent mechanism. When the environment becomes quiet, the brain increases sensitivity, increases perception, increases monitoring. That increase in monitoring can be interpreted as anxiety, but very often it is simply vigilance. There is also a phenomenon called neural deceleration. Neural deceleration is the gradual reduction of brain activity when the environment becomes calm. This process should lead to relaxation, but in systems accustomed to constant activity, deceleration can create discomfort. Because the brain is not used to stillness, it is used to movement, to stimulation, to occupation. When activity decreases, the system perceives change, and change requires attention. This mechanism explains why some people feel restless in silence. The body does not recognize stillness as normal. It recognizes stillness as unfamiliar, and the unfamiliar activates vigilance. Another important concept helps explain this: tolerance for silence. Tolerance for silence is the capacity of the nervous system to remain comfortable in calm environments. This capacity varies from person to person. It depends on experience. It depends on history. It depends on learning. Systems that lived through prolonged periods of pressure develop a lower tolerance for silence because silence is not part of the pattern, not part of the routine, not part of the experience. This learning creates a paradox. The body desires rest, but reacts to rest. The body needs silence, but distrusts silence. This conflict creates discomfort, a discomfort many people interpret as anxiety, but very often it is simply incomplete adaptation. There is also a mechanism called internal hypervigilance. Internal hypervigilance is the constant monitoring of signals from within the body, sensations, thoughts, emotions. This monitoring increases in silent environments because there are no external stimuli competing for attention. The focus turns inward, and that inward focus can reveal tensions, sensations, memories, concerns. These elements were always present, but they were hidden by movement. When movement decreases, they appear. Another relevant aspect emerges here. The brain functions as a prediction system. When the environment becomes quiet, it tries to anticipate what might happen. That anticipation increases attention, increases vigilance, increases readiness. This state can be interpreted as discomfort, but in reality, it is preparation. There is a detail many people have never noticed. The brain does not react only to what happens. It also reacts to what stops happening. When the environment becomes quiet, something disappears. Movement decreases, sounds decrease, tasks decrease, distractions decrease. And that reduction of stimulation creates a sensory gap. That gap is not dangerous, but it is unfamiliar, especially for a system accustomed to constant stimulation. Throughout most of the day, the brain receives signals, conversations, messages, noise, information, movement. These signals keep the system occupied, keep focus directed outward, keep attention distributed. When those signals disappear, the brain needs to reorganize. This process of reorganization can create discomfort, not because there is threat, but because there is change. There is a concept called stimulus suppression. Stimulus suppression occurs when the brain reduces the amount of information it needs to process. This process should facilitate rest, but in systems accustomed to constant activity, reduction of stimulation can be interpreted as loss of control, and loss of control activates vigilance. This mechanism helps explain why some people turn on the television to fall asleep, or leave music playing, or keep their phone nearby. Not necessarily out of necessity, but out of familiarity. Sound creates predictability. Noise creates a sense of control. Silence creates uncertainty. And uncertainty activates attention. Another interesting phenomenon appears at this point: habituation to stimulation. Habituation to stimulation means the brain becomes accustomed to high levels of activity. Over time, that level of activity becomes normal, expected, comfortable. When activity decreases, the system perceives difference, and that difference generates alertness, not because silence is dangerous, but because silence is different. That detail completely changes the interpretation. The discomfort does not come from silence. The discomfort comes from change. Change requires adaptation, and adaptation requires energy. Another important concept appears here: sensory decompression. Sensory decompression is the gradual reduction of stimulation, a progressive return to a state of calm. This process does not happen instantly. It requires time. Just as the body needs time to slow down after physical effort, the brain needs time to slow down after a demanding day. Without that time, the system remains activated, even in silence. Another important detail appears at this point. The brain has a specific network that becomes more active when the environment becomes quiet. This network is called the default mode network. The default mode network is responsible for internal reflection, memory planning, self-evaluation, imagination. When the environment becomes quiet, This network becomes active, and the mind begins to think, to review, to analyze, to remember, to project. This functioning is natural, but it can be interpreted as discomfort, especially when thoughts are intense, or repetitive, or unfinished. There is a term for this: quietness anxiety. Quietness anxiety is the discomfort that arises when the environment becomes calm, not because there is threat, but because silence allows contact with one's internal world. That contact can reveal unresolved concerns, accumulated tension, suppressed emotions, recurring thoughts. These elements were always present, but they were hidden by activity. When activity decreases, they become visible. Another concept helps explain this phenomenon: residual vigilance. Residual vigilance is the state of alertness that remains even after demands have ended. This state does not disappear immediately. It decreases gradually. Just as the body remains accelerated for a few minutes after running, the brain remains attentive for some time after an intense day. That time is necessary, but it can create discomfort, especially when a person expects immediate relaxation. There is also an important factor related to tolerance for inactivity. Tolerance for inactivity is the capacity to remain comfortable without stimulation, without tasks, without movement, without distraction. This capacity is not automatic. It is learned, and systems accustomed to constant activity may struggle with this process, not because of inability, but because of adaptation. Another relevant detail emerges here. Silence removes distractions, and by removing distractions, it increases perception, internal perception, emotional perception, bodily perception. That increase in perception can be interpreted as discomfort, but in reality, it is awareness, expanded awareness, clearer awareness, more sensitive awareness. This process is essential for recovery, but it requires time for adaptation, time for deceleration, time for safety. Without that time, silence feels strange, and the body remains alert. Even without reason, there is a point that completely changes the way we see silence. Discomfort does not mean something is wrong. It means something is being perceived. Throughout much of the day, the brain operates in response mode, solving problems, answering messages, making decisions, processing information. This rhythm keeps the mind occupied, keeps the system in motion, keeps attention directed outward. When silence arrives, that movement decreases, and attention changes direction. It leaves the outside world and turns inward. That shift in direction is natural, but it can feel unfamiliar, especially for a system accustomed to constant activity. There is a simple principle here. The brain adapts to the rhythm it lives in. If it lives in constant stimulation, it learns stimulation. If it lives in constant movement, it learns movement. If it lives in constant alertness, it learns alertness. When silence appears, the system needs to learn a different rhythm, a slower rhythm, a steadier rhythm, a more predictable rhythm. That learning does not happen instantly. It happens through exposure, through repetition, through familiarity. The more the body experiences silence with safety, the more silence stops feeling like threat and begins to feel like rest. There is another important detail. Silence does not eliminate activity. It changes the type of activity. The body slows down, but the brain continues working, organizing memories, processing experiences, integrating information. This process is essential for recovery, and it happens mainly when the environment becomes quiet. There is a scientific term for this: offline processing. Offline processing is the silent work the brain performs when external demands decrease. This work includes memory organization, emotional regulation, learning consolidation, mental energy restoration. Without this process, the mind does not fully recover. That is why silence is necessary, even when it feels uncomfortable. Another concept helps explain this phenomenon: cognitive incubation. Cognitive incubation is the process in which the brain continues analyzing information without conscious effort. While you rest, the system continues working. While you step away, the brain continues organizing. While you become quiet, the mind continues processing. This functioning explains why many ideas appear during moments of pause, during a shower, during a walk, during rest. It is not coincidence, it is biology. There is still another detail many people have never noticed. The brain does not work only with thoughts. It works with bodily signals, heartbeats, breathing, muscle tension, physical sensations. When the environment becomes quiet, these signals become clearer, more noticeable, more present. That perception can create discomfort, but it also creates awareness. And awareness allows regulation. Regulation allows recovery. Recovery allows balance. This is the natural cycle of the nervous system. There is also an important emotional aspect. Silence reduces distraction, and by reducing distraction, it allows contact with internal experiences that were often ignored, postponed, pushed aside, or avoided. That contact may feel uncomfortable at first, but it is necessary for adaptation, because the system needs to recognize what it feels in order to reorganize itself. This process is gradual, not immediate, not automatic, gradual. Another relevant detail appears here. Silence creates space, space to notice, space to process, space to recover. Without space, the system remains busy, and a busy system does not rest. It simply continues functioning. There is a phrase that summarizes this functioning. Silence does not create thoughts. Silence reveals thoughts. That revelation can be intense, especially in the beginning, but it tends to decrease over time. As the system learns that silence is safe, this learning is called habituation. Habituation means the brain adapts to a new state, a calmer state, a more predictable state, a more stable state. With repetition, silence stops feeling strange and begins to feel familiar. This process is similar to what happens when someone learns to swim. At first, the water feels dangerous. The body becomes tense. Breathing changes. Attention increases. With practice, the water stops feeling threatening and begins to feel comfortable. Silence follows the same logic. It needs to be experienced, repeatedly, with safety. Another important concept appears here: biological trust. Biological trust is the internal sensation that the body is safe, not because someone said so, but because the system perceived it. That perception depends on experience, depends on repetition, depends on predictability. When the system accumulates experiences of safety, it reduces vigilance, reduces tension, reduces effort. This process is not mental, it is physiological. And physiology takes time. Now consider something essential. Discomfort in silence is not failure. It is transition. A transition between activity and recovery, between alertness and rest, between protection and relaxation. That transition may be slow, but it is necessary, because the body needs to learn how to slow down. Another important point emerges here. Silence is not the absence of life, it is the presence of recovery. It is the moment when the system reorganizes energy, reorganizes attention, reorganizes balance. This process happens every day, but it only works when there is pause. Without pause, there is no recovery. Now consider the main insights from this video. You may have realized that silence increases perception, not danger. You may have understood that the absence of stimulation reveals internal sensations, that the mind continues processing even when the body rests, that the brain needs time to slow down. That adaptation to silence happens through repetition. At certain moments, it may have become clear that discomfort in silence is a natural response. A response of transition, a response of adaptation. You may also have noticed the idea of offline processing, a silent activity that allows recovery, or the concept of cognitive incubation, where the brain continues organizing information during rest. And possibly the most important realization of all, silence is not dangerous. Silence is necessary. If any of these ideas made sense to you, Share in the comments which concept stood out the most. It may have been a sentence, an insight, a concept, or a turning point. Because clarity often begins when we can name what we are feeling, and when you share that realization, someone else may finally understand their own experience. There is still one question that naturally arises. What happens when the body finally stops, but the mind remains active? When rest begins, but the system stays alert? When silence arrives, but the brain keeps working? That is exactly the question we will explore in the next video. Because sometimes, the body is resting, but the brain is not.